Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Engagement and Outreach Division Manager for the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to another one of our 50th anniversary events. 2022 marks 50 years since the founding of our agency, originally called the Human Relations Commission, and we mark this year by honoring the legacy of Prince Georgian Teresa Douglas Banks. Mrs. Banks was a committed community servant. She advocated for the formation of our agency, particularly in response to police violence against Black Prince Georgians. She served as council member to the first town council for the town of Glenarden. She fought for racial equality in many areas, particularly for wage parity for teachers. She herself was both a teacher and a principal in Prince George's County schools. She served her church. She ran for school board. She volunteered. She advocated. She advocated. She advocated. Our agency owes its existence to Teresa Douglas Banks. We look to her life of service, her fierce commitment to equity, and her belief in a better Prince George's County as a model for all of our work. We are in her debt. Joining me as co-host this evening is Renee Battlebrooks, Executive Director of the the Office of Human Rights. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome in conversation as part of our ongoing series with NewSouth Books and the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, Cynthia Tucker and Frye Gaillard, authors of the upcoming book coming out on March 15th, The Southernization of America, A Story of Democracy in the Balance. Cynthia Tucker is a journalist in residence at the University of South Alabama, is former editorial page editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where she won the Pulitzer Prize. She is a frequent commentator on television and radio and is a native of Monroeville, Alabama. Frye Gaillard, writer in residence at the University of South Alabama, is the award-winning author of A Hard Rain, America in the 1960s. He is also co-author with Marty Rosner of the children's book, The Slave Who Went to Congress, and we were happy to have both him and Marty in conversation on that book just a couple of months ago. He is the former Southern editor at the Charlotte Observer and a native of Mobile. So welcome to you all.
Thank you very much. Glad to be with you.
Could you take a few minutes just to start us off by introducing us to the work?
Yeah, Cynthia and I are colleagues at the University of South Alabama, and we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years not only teaching our classes and coordinating programs on campus, during which we try to facilitate the discussion of important issues that face the country and will face our students when they emerge out into the world. But she and I have also talked a lot between ourselves just about our current American moment, our current political moment in the country, which we think is at a critical juncture. I mean, the subtitle of our book is A Story of Democracy in the Balance. And we think it does kind of hang in the balance in these times, maybe as much as it ever has in the history of the country. I mean, we can certainly talk about the divisions that occurred that led to a civil war back in the 1860s, and as bloody and awful as that was, at least it ended with the benefit that it eradicated the institution of slavery. It seems to us that where we are right now is, if anything, even more uncertain. So we were talking about all of this, and I got an email from our friend Randall Williams, who is the editor-in-chief at NewSouth Books. And Randall asked me, he said, would you have a few thousand words in you about what I would call, he said, the Southernization of America? And immediately I thought of the book by the great Southern journalist John Egerton, who almost 50 years ago wrote a book called The Americanization of Dixie, the Southernization of America, in which he argued that as the separation of the South from the rest of the country breaks down, as it becomes less a region set apart, it and the nation as a whole are influencing each other in a lot of different ways. Some of those, he said, were good, and some were not so good. And it occurred to me as Randall and I began to discuss his idea, and I suggested that we bring Cynthia into the process, um, that what John Egerton was describing 50 years ago is ongoing and unresolved. And so the question that we pose in the book is, how much has the South influenced the rest of America, and in what ways? And it seemed to us that there are two parallel answers to that question. One is that because the South, historically, going all the way back to colonial times, was the epicenter of the enslavement of Africans brought against their will to the American continent. Because the South was the epicenter of that, it also became the epicenter of American racism. And so racism and all of the undemocratic and sometimes violent impulses that go with it are, we believe, without question, one of the unfortunate exports from the South to the rest of the country. But we also believe that there's another South that has exported something very different, that has influenced the country, we hope, in very different ways. And that's the South of the civil rights movement. That's the South of Jimmy Carter and his commitment to human rights around the world. That's the South of John Lewis and his fierce defense of voting rights. That's the South of Stacey Abrams, who is the current champion of voting rights in the state of Georgia, or Raphael Warnock, the first black senator from Georgia, U.S. senator from Georgia, who pastors the church that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once led in Atlanta, and who said recently that in his maiden speech before the Senate, Senator Warnock pointed out that he holds the Senate seat formerly held by the arch segregationist Herman Talmadge. And Senator Warnock said, "That's why I love America." And he thought of his own story as the story of a native Georgian. You know, Cynthia and I are native Alabamians. And so we've seen the both of these Souths, if you will, both of these strains, these dimensions in the character of the South, having their influence on the country as a whole, as the country as a whole has its influence on the South. So it goes both ways. Um, you can certainly make the case that there's, we think, some bad stuff in the air right now. There's been a lot of division in the country, racism that we thought we didn't think it was dead, but we thought it was in retreat, and maybe now it seems not to be. The election of Donald Trump, which he began his campaign by demonizing a whole group of people, namely Mexican immigrants, and kind of lumped a whole group of people as, as violent people and rapists and those kind of things. Well, that's nuts. And it's shameful that he did that. And it's even more disturbing that it didn't automatically disqualify him in the minds of most Americans. But we were concerned about this kind of stuff before that, when America at first seemed to have reached a threshold, a plateau that could not be reversed. And that is when we elected our first African American president, a brilliant young black man and his beautiful family became the occupants of the White House. Now, it's a fine thing if anybody wants to disagree with the policies of any president. That's what democracy is. And there's stuff you could disagree with rationally about President Obama's policies. I disagreed with some of them. Sometimes I was maybe to the left of him, but I disagreed with some of his policies. But that's not the only thing that happened. what happened when he was elected was that people were willing to believe, with no evidence to support it, just the most hideous things about the Obamas. They believed that Barack Obama was not born in this country. They believed that that he was a Muslim, and that raised questions about his patriotism and his qualifications. Uh, that people failed to even be able to see that what a beautiful family this was. Those kind of things seem to us to be a myopia rooted in some kind of racial blindness, and it was very disheartening. So we try to deal with those things in the book, while at the same time pointing out, uh, that it's not a partisan thing. When John Lewis died, one of the people who spoke at his funeral was former President George W. Bush. And President Bush, a conservative Republican from Texas, mentioned that one of the things he was proud of was signing an extension of the Voting Rights Act, and realizing that John Lewis had championed voting rights as much as any other person. So, that's what the good South looks like. That's what the South that influences this country in beneficial ways looks like: a bipartisan commitment to democracy and to the right to vote. But we also worry that commitment is shakier now because of voter suppression and gerrymandering, and also because of a political divisions in which we tend to demonize, almost dehumanize people who disagree with us. And you can't have a democracy very easily when that's the case. I remember reading when I was just out of college an article by Bill Moyers that took up the whole issue of Harper's Magazine, and it was called "Listening to America." And Moyers was saying back during that divided time in 1971 uh, that he feared we had stopped listening to each other in this country, that we had stripped away what he called the veneer of civility. And veneer sounds like something that's shallow and therefore inconsequential, but what he was talking about was our willingness to encounter each other with a sense of mutual respect, even if we find that we disagree, and that we have to hold on to that respect so that we can talk about issues and debate them and disagree about them, and yet still have a democracy uh, where we can live in peace and harmony with each other. So that's the kind of stuff we're talking about in the book, and we can certainly answer some questions about it. But I wonder, Cynthia, would you want to read something from the book that gives a sense of the flavor of it?
Certainly.
That would be cool, I think.
I'd be happy to. Um, I want to say first that the book begins in the 1970s, after Egerton had published his book, which came out in 1974. So we start in the 1970s. The book flows in chronological order, but it's by no means a history. Frye and I decided to pick the points in time that interested us, that we wanted to write about, and that we thought were influential both in the life of the South and in the life of the nation. So I'm going to start in a chapter that begins with the massacre at Mother Emanuel in Charleston. And that set off another widespread debate throughout the South and the nation, quite frankly, on Confederate iconography. And I'm going to read an excerpt where I'm talking about my own childhood, my observations, and what I later saw in my journalism career. As a native of Monroeville, Alabama, I can attest to the unthinking devotion to the lost cause of many white Southerners who have been spoon-fed lies about the Civil War since infancy. During my childhood, Alabama's public school textbooks, as they did throughout the region, downplayed slavery, ignored it as the root cause of the Civil War, and spoke of a federal government that imposed unfair demands on the patriotic South before and after the war. Across the South, flags emblazoned with the St. Andrew's Cross and stars were ever present above county courthouses and state capitals, on vehicle tags, on the shoulder patches and badges of state trooper and police uniforms, on the walls of private SEG academies, on t-shirts, caps, bumper stickers, flagpoles, and yard signs of private homes and businesses. The rebel flag has also been co-opted by white extremists since the 1950s. The symbol is as recognizable as the Coke bottle, and tellingly, the KKK hood and robe and burning cross. Many all-white public schools ignored the National Memorial Day, celebrated on the last Monday in May, and instead celebrated Confederate Memorial Day, which is absurdly still an official state holiday in Alabama, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Here, I mark one of the few benefits of segregated schools where I spent my pre-high school years. Black principals ignored Confederate Memorial Day. By the 1990s, though, a few courageous white Southern leaders had begun to campaign against the iconography of the lost cause, especially the rebel flag, which was raised above government buildings in a number of Southern states, in large part as a defiant response to the 1954 Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. In 1993, Georgia Governor Zell Miller issued a powerful call to remove the rebel emblem from his state's official flag, to which the Southern Cross had been added in 1956. In Alabama, the rebel flag was placed atop the state capitol in 1963 during the first George Wallace administration, where it stayed despite successive lawsuits. Finally, Governor Jim Folsom Jr. let the rebel flag come down in 1993. The change Governor Miller backed in Georgia didn't immediately succeed, but his successor, Roy Barnes, managed to get a rebel-free compromise flag raised in 2001. Miller had laid out the issues a decade earlier. A native of the North Georgia mountains who spoke with a deep Southern twang, he could hardly have been mistaken for an outsider who simply didn't understand. His ancestors had fought for the Confederacy. In his speech on the flag, he said, in part, "For 4 brief years, Georgia was a member of the Confederate States of America. Yet it is the Confederacy's most inflammatory symbol that dominates our state flag today. We all know why, and it has nothing to do with the bravery of the Confederate troops. It is clear the state flag was changed in 1956 to identify Georgia with the dark side of the Confederacy, both the desire to deprive some Americans of the equal rights that are the birthright of all Americans, and yes, the determination to destroy the United States if necessary to achieve that goal." Miller was no fool. He was a shrewd politician who'd already counted votes in the Georgia General Assembly, and he knew he would lose on the flag issue. I, too, knew he'd lose. I, too, had crusaded against the rebel flag as an official state symbol, writing opinions pieces, giving speeches, participating in panel discussions. I challenged the notion of happy slaves, good slave owners, and the rebel flag as a necessary symbol of heritage. I was told that I didn't understand the South, though I'm as Southern as gravy on biscuits. I was told that I didn't understand heritage, though I understood the difference between theirs and mine quite well. I was told that I wanted to rewrite the past, though I wasn't the revisionist in the room. I am still stunned by the level of self-deception among Confederate sympathizers and taken aback by the mind-torturing contradictions required for them to believe lost cause lies.
Yeah, that passage really struck me when I was reading the book, and several of the themes that you talk about, and the same that Frye talked about, sort of some of the symbolism, some of the things that we who don't live in the South believe, perhaps erroneously. But I was struck towards the beginning of the book when the foundation was being laid. And my question is really for those, and I'm encouraging everyone, go buy the book. It's fantastic. So March 15th, go buy the book. Mm-hmm. But if you would unpack what I call the head game, that is Viola Louisa, if I pronounce the name right, Jonathan Daniels, the person who was known but never tried for murder, Thomas Coleman, and Sheriff John Hewlett, because I think it illustrates the nuances and the dynamics and the complexities that perhaps we in the North think, well, I guess in Maryland, we're not really the North. We like to think of ourselves as being in the North. Don't tell the other Marylanders, they'll get angry. But yeah, it's just, can you sort of unpack that for everyone that's listening? And it's just an incredible story.
Frye, yeah, why don't you get started with that?
Okay, yeah. So Jonathan Daniels and Viola Louisa were white martyrs to the cause of civil rights. Both of them came to Alabama for the Selma to Montgomery March, and both of them were killed in the aftermath of that march. Mrs. Louisa on a lonely stretch of Highway 80 that between Montgomery and Selma on the day of the march when she was driving people back to Selma. And Jonathan Daniels, a young Episcopal priest, was killed a couple of months later by a white man in the town of Hayneville, Alabama, and everybody knew who did it. There were multiple eyewitnesses, and the killer was named Thomas Coleman. He was a prominent white man in the community, and he was acquitted because the jury just thought that Jonathan Daniels had it coming. That was even the argument that was made by his defense attorneys. Well, a few years later, a man by the name of John Hewlett became the first black sheriff of Lowndes County, Alabama. This was only 4 years after Jonathan Daniels was killed. John Hewlett, the first African-American sheriff, had been one of the founders of what became the Black Panther Party. It was actually founded in Alabama, and one of its volunteers, Huey Newton, took that symbol back to California and founded the Black Panther Party of Self-Defense. But John Hewlett was involved in the Black Panther movement in Lowndes County, Alabama, became the first black sheriff 4 years after 5 years after, the martyrdom of Jonathan Daniels. So when he was running for sheriff, Tom Coleman, the white killer, called him and said, "John, I want to talk to you." And Hewlett had made a lifetime commitment to himself never to back down from any white guy. And so he agreed to get in Tom Coleman's car and ride with him through the very lonely back roads of Lowndes County, Alabama, and talk to him. And Tom Coleman said, I guess it's going to be payback time when you win this election. And John Hewlett said, no, Tom, it's not going to be payback, but we are going to enter into an era of colorblind justice. And Coleman said, well, it doesn't matter, I'm leaving anyway. And Hewlett said, basically, well, do what you need to do, but stay if you will, if you think you can handle colorblind life, because that's what we're going to try to do. Well, a short time after that, and I can't remember how much, but a matter of months, John Hewlett, after he was the sheriff, got a call in the middle of the night. And it was Tom Coleman telling him that there had been a bad wreck on I-65 as it passed through Lowndes County, and that there was all kinds of debris littering the highway, and offering, it was 2:00 in the morning, offering to go with Hewlett to clean up the mess. And Hewlett was a little worried. You know, here is a guy who had literally gotten away with murder, wanting to go with him. But they met, cleaned up the mess together, and Tom Coleman became one of John Hewlett's big supporters when Hewlett was the first black sheriff of Lowndes County. What does that all mean? We can all interpret it however we want, but somewhere in there, there's the impulse towards some kind of redemption, some kind of reconciliation. And whatever it says about Tom Coleman, think what it says about John Hewlett. That sort of Nelson Mandela-like impulse to have no interest in revenge whatsoever. And that's been the great gift of African Americans through the civil rights movement, not only to the South, but to the country as a whole. This remarkable grace to say, yeah, all of this terrible stuff happened. Too much terrible stuff keeps on happening. And yet that's where the hope lies. That's where the hope emanates from. I think more than anywhere else in America is the African American community. And as a white guy, I think that's a pretty remarkable thing and a gift for the rest of us that we could build on if we just wouldn't be stupid.
Yeah, I was very struck by that whole story because, as you said, it just it's filled with hope, and it just sort of symbolizes so much. I do want to jump, and then I'll let Kyla, but Kyla can jump in, and I'll be quiet. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to talk just briefly about sort of the Willie Horton. And before we get into that, what I loved about the book is how it really takes us through. Even though, Cynthia, you said it's not history, but it is sort of, it sort of is, but in a vibrant, I love history, but for those who think, oh, history, it's need to know because it really informs everything. And some of those things that you talked about, I lived through and was completely clueless. I may have been young, I may have been not so young for some of the others. And so this book really, it puts all the pieces together, and then it has me reflecting back on conversations that I would hear my father have, it's really, really well done. So the part of the book, and again, I'm going to be jumping around, not chronologically, of course, but
sure, that's fine.
The Willie Horton story and sort of how that was used. And the genesis of this, really, I want you to unpack for everyone listening, if we're talking about the Southernization of America, how this tactic and why, a lot of people remember, Lee Atwater, et cetera, et cetera. I will say before you start, the Willie Horton story, although I knew about it, I didn't know the Prince George's County connection. Mm. So we are sitting here, doing this, the Office of Human Rights in Prince George's County, and it's Prince George's County that Willie Horton came on the weekend pass. So for those listening, and he was prosecuted by my former office. in I think 1990 for those, not allegations now, but the confirmed or convicted fact. So could you kind of, because again, that's another type of symbolism to me of the Southernization of America.
Do you want to go with that, Cynthia? You want me to, or?
I can talk about that a little bit, and then Frye, I hope you will add.
Sure. Okay, sure.
So one of the things that Republicans unfortunately became very good at was what is now known by campaign strategists as the Southern strategy. And it was known as such because Republican politicians learned to appeal especially to resentful Southern white voters, aggrieved Southern white voters, with a coded racial appeal. They didn't go out and do a full George Wallace. What they did instead was talk about law and order. Richard Nixon talked about law and order in his 1968 campaign. There had been urban riots in the 1960s. As Frye writes eloquently in the book, often in response to police brutality. But Nixon and other campaign strategists used the riots as an excuse to talk about bringing law and order back. Now, many of the white voters responding to this appeal weren't crime victims, but there was something about the stereotypes that were already there. It was easy to talk about law and order and know that, again, a certain white voter, many Southerners, but probably some Northeasterners and Midwesterners as well, you said law and order and they heard Black criminal. And so the Southern strategy became one that's used even now, although I would argue that Donald Trump abandoned the code and just said what he meant explicitly. And so George H.W. Bush, whom we think of in many ways as this kind man who had the best interest of the country at heart. He didn't seem cruel in any way. He certainly didn't seem overtly racist. And this ad was not run by his campaign. The ad was run by an outside group, but they were supporting his campaign. So it was easy enough for Bush to distance himself from it. But I'll let Frye take up here on what Lee Atwater said he was going to do to Dukakis.
Yeah. So Lee Atwater was a young Republican campaign strategist born and raised in South Carolina. Very bright, handsome, privileged guy who had the world by the tail, he thought. And when George H.W. Bush got the Republican nomination, he was 17 points behind Michael Dukakis in the polls. And Lee Atwater said that he was not worried. He said, we will strip the bark off the little bastard, he said, meaning Dukakis, and make it seem like Willie Horton is his running mate. Now, Willie Horton was a convicted criminal who, on a weekend pass from prison in Massachusetts, a weekend furlough, which was a policy that Dukakis had supported, though he didn't initiate it, Willie Horton, on that weekend pass, came to Prince George's County and apparently committed a horrific crime of rape and pistol whipping a young white man and so forth. And so Atwater, though the Bush campaign didn't officially sponsor this ad that became very prominent, that featured a very menacing looking Willie Horton and sounded themes of law and order on the surface, but as Cynthia said, everybody knew the subtext was black crime, and it worked. Dukakis said, "We're getting killed." And in fact, George H.W. Bush won the election. The ad wasn't the only factor there, but it was certainly a factor. Not too long after that, Lee Atwater found himself staring at a diagnosis of terminal cancer as he in the shadow of his 40th birthday. Yeah. And Atwater said, as he was facing death at an early age, Atwater said he was sorry about all of this. He said, sorry about the quote about stripping the bark off the little bastard because it made him sound cruel, and sorry about the way he used Willie Horton to elect George H.W. Bush because he said it makes me sound racist, which I am not. And he said, maybe America can learn something on my dime. Our feeling is that whatever you think of Lee Atwater's deathbed confession, or in the looming shadow, in the shadow of death, Lee Atwater said he was sorry. Whatever your evaluation of that was, it's clear that a lot of politicians in this country learned nothing on Atwater's dime. And in fact have continued to demagogue in those ways even more overtly and maybe more cruelly than Atwater did. You know, I personally think Atwater probably meant it when he said he was sorry. One hopes he did, because it was a terrible thing. You know, it was terrible. It was a vicious, divisive strategy. You know, you could have a debate if you wanted to about the furlough program as Dukakis ran it. That would be fair game. Because probably you don't want to make that available to criminals with a history of violence. I mean, you could talk about that. That isn't what Atwater did. That isn't what that campaign ad did. That wasn't the purpose of it. The purpose was to raise the issue of race without quite saying the ugly part out loud, but coming pretty close. Now the ugly part is right out loud, as Cynthia just said.
Yes.
Yeah, it really is. Go ahead, Kyla. Sorry.
Well,
I'll just talk.
No. I mean, I can too. I'm like, I can't believe it. So let me just say this now. For those people who are watching, if you have any questions, please type them in the chat wherever you're watching, because we can just keep going forever and ever and ever. But if you type your questions into the chat, I'll make sure that we share them. And so this issue, I am not originally from the United States. And so I have a lot of ignorance about American politics on one hand. And that may be part of my excuse. But the other part of my excuse is that I am definitely guilty of the snippet reading, the snippet understanding. And I am trying to do better about that. And so just in full disclosure, I can't necessarily blame not originally being from the US as my problem. My problem might be my problem. And as I read this book, I was so struck. Okay, so first, change the subject. Renee, I know we're not a review show, but oh my gosh, 2 thumbs up. Amazing.
Definitely.
The book is so amazing. So I loved it and I was so riveted by it. And I was also so amazed by the depth and length of the coercion, the divisiveness, the underhandedness. So, you talk about Lee Atwater, but you also show things happening before what Karl Rove did to Mark Kennedy, like all of these things that have happened. And you mentioned George H.W. Bush. He chose to work with Lee Atwater and Roger Ailes, and that this has been going on. I mean, you start in the 70s, so we can see 50 years of divisiveness and destruction. And I think that the book makes a case for, and I certainly interpreted this from the book, a destruction of democracy in order to win. And I was sort of astounded and heartbroken as I was reading that, although grateful to be educated. And so I just sort of wanted to, I don't really know what I have. I have a specific question about that, but just so much about how much it struck me that there are decades. Like, I think those of us who are alive now can say, oh, wow, the last few years have felt really very divisive. But to be able to look back and see that this is 50 years of strategy, that in a way, the divisiveness of the last couple of years have been built a block at the time deliberately over 4 or 5 decades. Is that your experience? Like, have I interpreted that the way you interpret it?
Yes, you have. I think Frye, Frye is a very distinguished Southern journalist. So he's been watching politics for a long time. I have been watching politics for a long time. But I will say for myself, that even I was connecting some of the dots as I was writing, remembering things that happened 20 or 30 years ago. And one of the figures that I don't think we can leave out of a discussion about divisiveness in our public life is Newt Gingrich. Mm-hmm. Newt wasn't born in the South. He was born in Pennsylvania, if I remember correctly, and moved around a lot as a child because his father was in the military, his stepfather. But the South, Georgia in particular, gave the nation the gift, and I use the word gift very loosely here, of Newt Gingrich. He came south to go to college. He ran for office the first time from Georgia. He was working as a college professor in West Georgia at the time, and he was cynical even then. He ran for office the first time as a Rockefeller Republican, supporting environmental issues. He wasn't using the Southern strategy, but that didn't win for him. So when he won on his third try, he was always burning with ambition, and it became very clear to him what would win. Again, Newt was a college professor. He understood that he could use language in a certain way. And so he began to use the most divisive language to describe his Democratic rivals. And he literally taught, he held seminars to teach his fellow Republicans to do the same, to talk about Democrats as enemies, traitors, not people, fellow Americans with whom we disagree, but bad, corrupt people. That is part of Newt Gingrich's lasting legacy. And he was elected to office in the 80s. So that kind of divisiveness, it's been with us even longer, but the strains of it started decades before.
Yeah, I actually had my book open to that page because of that list of words, and I'm going to read it. He ran campaigns, so this is Newt Gingrich. He ran campaign seminars and issued audio tapes teaching Republicans to use slash and burn rhetoric to describe Democrats, fellow Americans though they were, sick, traitors, corrupt, bizarre, cheat, steal, devour, and self-serving were among the adjectives and nouns he recommended. And as I read that list and hearing you talk about some of those words and thinking how much we hear them, like they're entrenched. And that if that is the message that you've been hearing about somebody who thinks differently than you do for 30 years, 35 years, you've been repeating it, you've been listening to it, you've been raising your children like that, you've been hearing it in school. and this like what so and I think the book asks this question, like, so we win, but at what cost?
And one of the things that I was struck by today in one of my classes, I have students who are not yet 22 years old. This is all they know. For them, this represents normal politics and reasonable democratic small d tactics, when in fact there's nothing normal or reasonable about it.
Yeah, it's just as you said, Cynthia, this put all of the pieces together. All of the pieces together. I was also struck by, if you could explain to everybody listening what a legalese Christian is and the relationship to racism. And really, the underpinning really is about democracy. It is about saving our democracy. And it's deep.
Well, we're writing about the South, and the South remains the nation's, I won't call it the nation's most religious region. I'll call it the nation's most church-going region. And over the last 50 or 60 years, the same time period we're describing here, the religious right has become an extremely prominent force in our politics, starting with Jerry Falwell's so-called moral majority. And for those who are not particularly religious, especially those who don't know much about Southern Baptist and other conservative denominations, I wanted to make distinctions. And so one of the terms I used, it's not original to me, I borrowed it, was legalistic Christians. People who believe in certain rules. You're a Christian only if you follow these rules and do these things. And that is a mark of many conservative Christian churches. The thing that surprised me, though, and the reason one of the reasons I wanted to write about conservative Christians in the book, was that one of the rules that they claim to follow is sexual restraint. That they believe in a personal morality with sexual restraint at the core. But they abandoned that for a very zealous, if I may use that term, support of Donald Trump. And so it seemed to me that made the racism that was at the foundation of many white conservative Christian churches very clear. If in fact it's not about sexual restraint, what is it about? What did Donald Trump stand for?
Yeah, I love the way you set that whole chapter up with Dr. King's letter from jail. And I wrote some of it down. This is me paraphrasing what you wrote, but law and order, not equal rights, peace, not justice, calm, not change, equals conservative Christians. That was sort of Martin Luther King. So it's, the way you end your book, Will Americans Choose Democracy or Whiteness, sums up the whole, the Southernization of America. It's, anyway, Kyla, I know you have a question, but I wanted to talk about the education and the daughters of, is it the Confederacy?
Yeah, we can talk about that.
Yeah, let me find here in my notes. So I call them the right name. I'm so sorry.
The United Daughters
of
the
Noble
Confederacy.
Cause. Yes. The Noble Cause, the Daughters of the Confederacy, and sort of their influence in the school system, school curriculum, how history was taught. And I wanted you to contrast to our debate that's going on now with, so-called critical race theory and the 1619 And all of the laws that are being passed as we sit here talking, and all the books that are banned or being burned. Can just if we don't understand where we came from, we're not understanding this moment. So please unpack that for us.
Frye, you want to talk about that some? We actually talked about that some in one of our classes today.
We did. Yeah. It's interesting to me that the current debate over critical race theory and all the things that we mustn't talk about. We've been here before, right? We have, as you said, Renee, the United Daughters of the Confederacy had an enormous impact a few generations ago on what kids were taught in school. The fourth grade Alabama history textbook that was in use in Mobile County, where Cynthia and I are, as late as 1969, portrayed happy slaves, it said. And one of the sentences after making the case about how happy they were said, they show bright rows of white teeth. So that was in the public schools of Mobile when I was first beginning my career as a journalist, and I covered that controversy back then. Well, now you get the feeling that we're right back there in lots of ways, except now it's what we don't want to talk about. There has been some progress in education in talking with a little bit more honesty about slavery and those kinds of things, and racial cruelty that has existed in the country. We haven't gone far enough in fully understanding that heritage, but at least we begin to dip our toe in those educational waters. Well, there are people who want us to stop. And what they say is it'll make white kids feel bad. And two answers to that. One is maybe we should feel a little uncomfortable learning some of the things that were done in this country, some of the hard history that we lived through as a country. It isn't comfortable, and it's okay, therefore, to feel some discomfort. On the other hand, Cynthia and I have both talked about these things with younger children in schools under various circumstances, and it doesn't actually make white kids ashamed of being white when they learn about slavery or segregation or other things. What it makes them think is, oh, that's terrible. I wouldn't do that. I don't want to be on that side. I want to be on the side of treating people fairly and kindly. And some white people were on that side. I mean, there's a history of that too. And so, it's not that you shame little white kids when you tell them that people used to be enslaved in America. It's that you remind them of the source of our problems and the need to be intentional in crossing these racial divides that still exist in our country.
Can I just say that I happened to finish high school. My parents worked overseas. I was in Beirut, Lebanon, during the war, high school, and I was taught the daughters of the Confederacy they went around the world, because I was taught that the Civil War, the reason for the Civil War was states' rights, nothing more. Mm-hmm. So it's appalling. It is the rewriting of,
People always say states' rights when they mean racism in one form or another, whether it's slavery or segregation. Mm-hmm. George Wallace said states' rights. So did some of the people who were leaders of the Confederacy. But the secession documents all talk about slavery, and George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door.
No, exactly. And George Wallace, of course, has a connection to Prince George's County as well.
He was shot here.
In Laurel. Yeah, Laurel. Yeah. Anyway, I could talk for hours. I have lots of questions, but Kyla, I don't want to take all of the time.
No, I have the same. Which is like, oh my gosh. So, I mean, the thing that I felt as I was reading this, well, let me just say this. Renee and I, in partnership with the library system, we have a series that's voting democracy in action. And one of the things that the Office of Human Rights is doing and we're committed to talking about is democracy, why it's important, how you can participate in it, and why it's a good thing to participate in it. And, you know, however you vote, that being present and participating in grassroots campaigning, that matters. And so this book, which just seemed to me to highlight, as I said before, over decades, the erosion of our democracy, I mean, speaks to the work that Renee and I in the library are doing. And so much of what you talk about shows how this is happening. But one of the things that struck me was the fairness doctrine, which I had not heard about that until, well, let me just say this for all my history teachers out there. If I heard of it before now, I forgot. And so when I read this, I was like, oh my gosh. And that explains why the news looks the way that it is. And I'm sort of jumping to the end of the book for those of you who don't know what the fairness doctrine is. So I'm going to stop. Could one of you explain the fairness doctrine and what has happened in the last 20 years?
Well, it's no surprise that history teachers don't talk about the fairness doctrine. I wouldn't expect them to. I mentioned it in a couple of my classes, and my students seem surprised that there used to be such a thing. But the fairness doctrine gave the federal government a way to control, is much too strong a word, at least monitor and keep some guardrails on what was going out over the broadcast airwaves. And that meant that basically broadcast journalists were not only expected to air both sides of issues in the public interest, but they were also expected to occasionally dedicate some time, some prime time, to policy issues that we might consider boring today. You know, say a discussion of environmental issues, or a discussion of what's going on in Ukraine, and why a no-fly zone may or may not be a bad idea. And if this is aired in prime time, then some viewers are probably going to be exposed to it who wouldn't necessarily have thought, I want to know more about what's going on in Ukraine. But it ended in the 1980s during the Reagan administration, if I'm not mistaken. And that just opened up the airwaves. Now, this is before cable. The federal government was controlling the broadcast airwaves. And so that included radio. But when the fairness doctrine was ended, that just gave a lot of room to broadcasters such as Rush Limbaugh, who saw an opening for a certain kind of take on public affairs that had not been permitted before. There was a Rush Limbaugh of the 1930s, Father Coughlin, who had terribly anti-Semitic, pro-Nazi views. But the federal government went to broadcast stations and urged them to take him off the air, and they did. But that kind of influence no longer exists today. So the airwaves are flooded with Rush Limbaugh imitators, and with social media, it may be even worse.
This whole notion of misinformation and democracy, we don't really understand the huge ramifications. And if we don't understand that, if we just look at today and the Ukraine and the Russia conflict and how misinformation is playing into that whole issue as relates to democracy. So it's, maybe talk a little bit about, because it's going further than sort of the fairness doctrine, but this misinformation and the dangers.
Before we do that, and I think that's important, and I don't know how much time do we have? Are we
Well,
coming up on the end of the show?
That's a great question. We have actually reached time, but we're happy to keep going if you would like to keep going. We would love to keep talking to you for a little bit. If you can give us a few more minutes, we'd love it.
Well, let's talk just a few more minutes. And before we leave Prince George's County and George Wallace, I would like to throw out a little story of hope, and then we can come back to the other side, which is the very real challenges and the urgency of the moment. But here's a story of hope that occurred in Prince George's County. George Wallace, tragically for anybody, was shot through the spine in Prince George's County and paralyzed from the waist down, and spent the rest of his life in pain. When he was lying in the hospital bed, having been shot in Prince George's County, one of the people who came to visit him while he was in the hospital was Shirley Chisholm, who was considered one of the most outspoken African American members of the United States Congress. She was running for president, seeking the Democratic nomination, the first Black woman ever to do that, knowing she wouldn't get it, but wanting the forum to raise some important issues on behalf of people on the margins of American life. When George Wallace was shot, Shirley Chisholm went to see him in his hospital room. And George Wallace, according to his daughter, Peggy Wallace Kennedy, who is now herself a champion of human rights and civil rights and African American rights and all of those things, a champion of racial equity and reconciliation. But Peggy Wallace was there by her father's bed also. And she remembered seeing Shirley Chisholm and her father talking. She remembered seeing them praying together. She remembered Shirley Chisholm saying, when George Wallace asked her, "What are your people going to say when they know that you're here?" And she said, "It doesn't matter. What happened to you should not happen to anybody." Now, Peggy Wallace Kennedy thought that her father was forever changed by that visit. Not instantaneously, but that it continued to work on him and to work on his conscience. There were people who knew George Wallace who doubted his expressions of regret and his request for forgiveness among African American leaders. But one of the people who didn't doubt Wallace's sincerity was John Lewis, another great African American member of Congress, who visited George Wallace in Montgomery and said Wallace talking to him about the things that Wallace had done. Lewis said it was almost like somebody confessing to a priest. Now, make of that what you will, but what I'm saying is if Shirley Chisholm and George Wallace can find a way to talk to each other and influence each other, I mean, for goodness sake, the rest of us should be able to look at that as a kind of parable for what is possible in this country. And I would argue for what we have to do. I mean, we are a multicultural society that is baked in, that is not going to change. And we can be a place where symbolically and sometimes literally we shoot at each other rather than talk to each other and try to understand each other. Or we can really try to make it work. We can really try to make this a good place to live. And the moral choice is almost that simple. The political choices maybe are more complicated, and the policies needed to implement that hope are maybe more complicated. But we have to commit ourselves to that basic principle that we're in the same boat, we're in the same country, we're fellow Americans. And as soft-headed as that may sound, think of the stupidity of the alternative.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect place to end with hope. We will not talk about misinformation and democracy because that will just bring us down. But everybody should be aware. I mean, it's critically important. But That's such a beautiful way to end. Kyla, go ahead.
Yeah, well, there is a way out, and it is
Yes.
connecting. It's connecting with people, and it's talking to people who don't think like you, don't look like you, maybe don't even live in the same area that you live in. And it is one of our missions here at the Office of Human Rights to try to help people have those conversations. You are always welcome to reach out to us in all seriousness. We're happy to help facilitate conversations, give you any information that we have. We're here to help you. You can find us on the web at civilrights.mypgc.us. I really want to thank Cynthia and Frye for being with us tonight. It's been a wonderful conversation.
I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
This book, I'm so sorry. Thank you. This book is so good. I loved it. Renee and I have been texting about it. I've sent it. Yeah. I've pre-ordered it to like everyone and their mom. So if you know me personally, that's what you're getting in your mailbox next week. Yeah. One of the best ways you can support artists, writers, thinkers is by buying their work. And this was a great book, and it's a great way to support Cynthia and Frye. You can pre-order this book from your very favorite independent bookstore. The library, who are our partners for this event tonight, have wonderful event partners with Mahogany Books in Prince George's County. So you can also reach, if you'd like to buy from Prince George's County, we definitely want to send you to Mahogany Books. We have a bunch of other events coming up. I will not take your time. I know we've gone over time. So I'm just going to direct you to check out our events webpage. I will put that up on the right here on the banner, and we invite you to join us for a bunch of other things we have coming up. And again, Cynthia Frye, NewSouth Books and Prince George's County Memorial Library System, thank you so much for a wonderful event tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Everyone stay safe.